It was colder than it should have been for March. The kind of cold that clings to your wrists and creeps up your sleeves no matter how tightly you pull your coat around you. I remember the sound of gravel under my boots as I stepped out of the cab he'd never liked driving, so the driveway was mostly weeds and rock. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Shabbier. Funny how things shrink when the person anchoring them is gone. I was early. My father's will reading wasn't for another hour, but I'd asked for the keys from his lawyer. Said I wanted to sit in the old place one last time, maybe walk through the rooms before the vultures came. I had a scarf tied around my neck, a leather bag clutched under my arm, and the letter from the estate attorney folded so many times it was soft at the creases. I hadn't slept the night before. My mind was full of voices, his voice mostly short and gruff, and always withholding. As I approached the front steps, I saw him. A teenage boy, maybe 16, maybe 17, sitting on the porch like he'd been waiting. Hood-up jeans torn at the knees, sneakers too clean to match the rest of him. He had his elbows on his thighs, fingers threaded together like he was praying or bracing for impact. We locked eyes for a second. His were wide, brown, and oddly calm. I slowed, thinking maybe he was a neighbor's kid, someone who used to mow the lawn, maybe the mailman's son. But before I could speak, he stood and said it quietly, almost politely. "Are you, Eleanor?" I blinked. "Yes," he hesitated, like the next words might undo the ground beneath both of us. Then he said, "I think I'm your brother." It wasn't anger I felt at first. It wasn't even disbelief. It was stillness, like every sound disappeared, and all that was left was the wind picking through the brittle trees. Somewhere a crow called out long and loud. I laughed reflexively, softly. "I think you're confused," I said, already unlocking the door, already needing to get away from the boy and his impossible claim. But he didn't flinch. He just watched me with those familiar eyes. Too familiar. I remember how the key stuck in the lock. The old brass had always been finicky. I jiggled it like I'd done 100 times before, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The smell hit me, first dust and aftershave and something faintly sweet, like the bowl of hard candies my father kept by the window. The air was stale, unmoved. I turned around. He hadn't followed me in, just stood there, hands stuffed in his hoodie pocket, gaze steady. "You're not going to ask," he said. I wanted to slam the door shut to silence whatever lie was about to come out of his mouth. But I didn't. Something about the way he said it. Like he wasn't guessing. Like he knew. Instead I said, "How do you know my name?" He pulled out his phone and scrolled for a moment, then held it out to me. On the screen, a photo. Blurry. Old. My father sitting at a diner booth smiling, not that half smirk I was used to, but a real warm smile. Beside him, a younger boy. This boy. They were holding milkshakes. One chocolate, one vanilla. "He told me about you," he said. I don't remember walking into the living room, but I was suddenly there, standing next to my father's worn recliner. The chair he'd spent every night in for 2 decades watching war documentaries and sipping scotch. It still had the faint indent of his shoulders. The boy stepped inside now, slowly, reverently, as if the house were a church and I were some high priestess of its ghosts. "He said you'd probably be angry," he said, "that you might not believe me." I sat down in the recliner and pressed my hands to my knees. My breath was shallow, like I was trying to breathe through cloth. "What's your name?" I asked, voice dry. He looked down. "Jonah." Of course it was. I stared at him, willing something in my brain to make this make sense. I wanted to find the flaw in the story. A tell? A slip. But there was none. only his voice level and patient like he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "He said you took care of him, that you stayed when nobody else did." I closed my eyes. I didn't want his praise, not secondhand, not filtered through a stranger's mouth. He stepped back, sensing something shift. "I can wait outside," he said. I just wanted to be here today." When I opened my eyes, he was at the doorway again, 1 foot outside, 1 inside. He left something Jonah added, "For both of us. That's what the lawyer said." I nodded once. Not because I believed him, not yet, but because something was unraveling, something that had been tight in my chest for years. A knot I hadn't known was there until it loosened. And that look in his eyes, God help me, it was the same look my father used to give me when he didn't have the words to say sorry. I was 26 when my mother collapsed on the kitchen floor. The kettle had just begun to sing. She was reaching for her pills when her knees buckled beneath her, and she crumpled hard onto the linoleum. I heard the fall before I saw it. The thud was sharp, final. My father didn't shout. He didn't even curse. He just knelt beside her, pressed 2 fingers to her neck, and whispered, "Call someone." That was the beginning of everything unraveling. She survived the stroke, but the woman who returned from the hospital wasn't the mother I'd known. Her left side never fully came back. Her speech slowed, and her eyes, they were softer somehow, like someone had washed out the brightness and replaced it with a sort of distant fogged grace. I moved back into the house that week, gave notice at the law firm where I was clerking, and told myself I'd only stay until things stabilized. They never did. For nearly 10 years I stayed. I cooked her meals, spooned her crushed pills into applesauce, learned the schedule of her diapers, the exact angle to hold her so she wouldn't choke when she swallowed water. I read to her on Sundays. I rubbed her feet when she couldn't sleep. I took the night shifts so my father could rest, though most nights I'd hear the soft clink of ice against glass coming from the den. He never drank around her, only after. Only when the house had gone still and the quiet made his bones itch. People used to ask me why I never married. I'd smile, lie, say I was too picky or too focused on work. The truth was, no one ever asked me to stay, but I was always asked to stay behind. There's a difference. I was the one who picked up the prescriptions, who remembered the codes to the insurance forms, who noticed when the bruises on her legs began to fade slower than they should. My brother Simon moved to California the year after her stroke. "I can't do it," he'd said, as if it were a decision about dinner. He visited once a year, sent flowers on her birthday, wired money for Christmas gifts he never saw opened. I didn't hate him for it, not really. I just stopped expecting more. When you let go of expecting things, it makes the silences easier to sit through. My father and I never spoke about my sacrifice. He never said thank you, but I told myself he knew. There were gestures his silence when I poured his scotch just the way he liked it, the way he'd leave the newspaper open to the crossword for me. He wasn't a man of warmth, but he wasn't cruel, and I took that as affection. I thought it meant something. When my mother died, I bathed her body myself. The nurses offered, but I insisted. I needed to feel her skin one more time, cold and heavy as it was. I combed her hair. I kissed her forehead. My father stood in the doorway, his silhouette long and tired. When I asked him if he wanted a moment alone, he shook his head and turned away. He didn't cry. Not that day. Not at the funeral. Not once. He wore the same navy suit he'd worn to Simon's wedding, buttoned to the collar. I caught him staring at the minister once, Not listening, just staring, as if the voice were coming from inside his own skull. After the burial, he walked back to the car in silence. Didn't speak a word the entire ride home. That night, I heard the recliner groan under his weight and the soft flick of his Zippo lighter. I cleaned out her things slowly. I couldn't bear to do it all at once. One drawer at a time, one blouse, one scarf, one old letter at a time. I found notes she'd written to herself, reminders taped to the bathroom mirror. Brush teeth. Drink water. Eleanor loves you. I sat with that last one for a long time. The ink was smudged, probably from steam, but I could still read the words. Eleanor loves you. It gutted me. For a while, I thought the silence between me and my father would lift. That maybe with her gone, he and I could finally speak like people who'd endured something together. But he grew more withdrawn. He started locking the shed out back. Took trips up north without telling me why. He'd leave a note on the table. Gone a few days. Don't worry. And that was that. I didn't press. Maybe part of me didn't want to know. I told myself the silence was grief. That was the lie I clung to. Looking back now, I see how much of my life I lived for him. I let the world narrow around his habits, his moods, his silences. I gave up the man I was seeing because he said it was inappropriate to have company while the house was still grieving. I missed out on 2 job interviews because he needed the car. I stopped wearing red lipstick because it reminded him of my mother, and he couldn't look at me when I had it on. I didn't think of it as sacrifice back then. I thought of it as love. And it never occurred to me not once that he might have had a whole second life blooming in the background. A life with softness, with joy, with Jonah. Not once. After she died, I started listening more closely to the silences in the house. Not just the absence of her voice, or the quiet hum of the oxygen machine that used to fill the hallway, but a new silence. Dense. Weighted. Like the house was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. At first it was little things. The shed always locked. My father had never been particularly handy, and he hadn't touched a lawnmower in years. But one afternoon I saw him back there through the kitchen window unlocking it with a small silver key he kept on a chain around his neck. He was holding something in his hands pressed tight to his chest like it might break if anyone saw it. I stood at the window for 10 minutes after he went inside, trying to decide whether to go out there. I didn't. Then there were the calls. They started about 6 months after the funeral. He'd never been much of a phone talker, hated technology, even refused to get a cell phone, but suddenly the landline would ring around the same time each Thursday evening. I'd hear the receiver lift. A long pause, then his voice soft and careful. Sometimes a laugh. A real one. Not the dry chuckle he gave me when I made a joke. Not the grunt of polite acknowledgement. This was different. Intimate, private. The first time I asked, he said it was a buddy from the Legion. The second time, he told me not to be nosy. By the third time, he didn't bother offering an answer at all, just took the phone into the den and closed the door. I remember one night I passed the hallway and caught his reflection in the mirror. He was standing there holding the phone to his ear, head tilted like a boy in love. I froze. There was a softness in his face I hadn't seen in years, maybe ever, and something inside me, something long quiet, began to ache. I told myself I was being paranoid, that he deserved a private life, that he'd lost his wife of 40 years and needed comfort whatever shape it came in. But the ache didn't go away, not when I saw the travel receipts in the drawer. Not when I found the plane ticket stub tucked into the pocket of his coat. Ottawa. Twice in 2 months. He told me he was going fishing with friends. It didn't make sense. He hated flying. Then there was the cologne. One afternoon I came home early from the store and caught a scent in the air, faint but sharp. Not the one he used to wear, not the familiar musk that clung to his recliner. This was floral, almost sweet. I followed the trail into the laundry room. His shirt was draped over the edge of the basket. I picked it up and brought it to my nose. Perfume. Not my mother's. That night I sat in the kitchen staring at the calendar, trying to make sense of his trips. There was a pattern, always Thursdays, always returning by Sunday evening. I pulled out one of the yellow notepads I used to keep grocery lists on and began writing down dates, destinations, receipts I'd accidentally seen. I wasn't proud of it. It made me feel small. But something had shifted and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I asked him once, directly, "Who are you visiting?" He didn't look up from his bowl of soup. "Old friends. I found the receipts." He paused, spoon midair. "Then you should already have your answer." That was the end of it. The next day, the yellow notepad was gone from the kitchen drawer. But what I remember most, more than the missing notepad, more than the perfume, and more than the long silences, was the sound I heard one night when I couldn't sleep. It was late. The house was quiet, the wind moving through the trees in soft, rhythmic sighs. I went to get a glass of water and saw the light on in the backyard shed. The door was slightly ajar. I walked out slowly, barefoot on the cold grass, wrapping my sweater tighter around me. Inside, I heard him crying. Not loud, not gasping, just weeping. I froze at the door. He wasn't saying her name, not once. He was whispering something over and over. I leaned in. "I'm sorry. I should have told her. I should have told her." Then silence. Then a long exhale. I stepped back before he could hear me, tiptoed back through the grass, heart pounding, stomach twisting. I sat on the couch until morning, not turning on the light, just waiting for something to make sense. He never brought it up. Neither did I. But from that day on, I knew there was something living in this house alongside us. Some truth pressed tight between floorboards. Something I wasn't supposed to find. I started having dreams of a little boy standing in the hallway calling out for someone, not me. Of my father kneeling beside a crib humming a lullaby I didn't recognize. I'd wake up sweating, gasping for air. I chalked it up to grief, to the long tale of mourning, to loneliness maybe. But in the light of morning, those dreams left a film on my skin that wouldn't wash off. I began watching him more closely, not like a daughter, like an outsider. As if I'd been cast in a play I hadn't auditioned for, as if I were waiting for a line that never came. The man who sat at the breakfast table wasn't the man who cried in the shed. The man who refused to hug me at my mother's funeral wasn't the same man who apparently called someone every Thursday night and laughed like he'd been given a second chance. And that look he gave me when I asked questions, not angry, not guilty, just tired, like he'd already accepted that I'd never really know him. The day of the will reading, I wore black, not for tradition, not for him. For the space between us that had never been mourned properly, for the questions that hung in the air like thick dust, undisturbed, waiting for some gust of honesty that never came. The lawyer's office was on the 3rd floor of an old building downtown, one of those places that still had dark wood paneling and velvet chairs with cracked arms. I remember the way the elevator groaned, the way the hallway smelled of stale paper and someone's strong coffee. The room where we sat was too warm. I took off my coat but left my gloves on. I didn't want to touch anything. His name was Ralph Murray. Mid-60s, kind eyes, a nervous, throat-clearing habit. He knew me, had sent me Christmas cards for years. But that morning he looked at me like I might break in half, like he knew something I didn't and wished he didn't have to be the one to say it.
"Thank you for coming, Eleanor,"
he said, gesturing to the armchair across from his desk. "Would you like some water?" I shook my head. He hesitated, opened a folder, shuffled some pages like he needed to stall. "Your father's will is brief," he said. "Straightforward in most ways." "Most ways." He cleared his throat again. "You're the primary beneficiary of the estate. The house, his personal effects, the remaining savings account." He paused. His eyes flicked up, then down. "There is, however, one additional matter." I waited. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it toward me. "There's a monthly disbursement of $1,500, set up to continue for, well, indefinitely. The recipient's name is Jonah K. Your father insisted you'd understand." I stared at the name. Jonah. The same name the boy on the porch had given me. The boy who'd said he was my brother. The boy I had walked away from without asking for proof, because denial was warmer than the chill settling into my bones now. I didn't say a word, just picked up the sheet and ran my thumb across the ink. It was real, legal, documented. "Do you know who that is?" Ralph asked gently. I nodded once, but I didn't. Not really. That afternoon I drove back to the house in silence. The radio stayed off, the windows up. My fingers clenched the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. It had started to drizzle just enough to make the world look blurry, like the sky was crying on my behalf. Inside the house, everything was where I'd left it. A half-drunk cup of tea on the kitchen table, a coat slung over the chair, a scarf still hanging on the peg by the door. It looked lived in, like I'd only stepped out for a moment, not for a funeral. The ache in my stomach spread to my throat. I wasn't going to look for it. I wasn't going to dig. But my body moved before I had time to think. I went into his room, something I hadn't done since we cleared out my mother's things, and opened the drawer where he kept his socks. There was an envelope. Plain, unsealed, thick with something inside. On the front, in his handwriting, the same careful cursive he used on birthday cards, the same looped letters I'd seen on tax forms and post-it notes, was written, "Forgive me." My hands shook as I opened it. There was a photograph. A woman I didn't recognize, long dark hair, smiling eyes, maybe in her late 20s, holding a baby boy. He couldn't have been more than a few months old. They were sitting on a park bench, sunshine behind them, a blur of green trees in the distance. I turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back in my father's hand, Jonah, 2007. Your brother. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the picture in my lap like it was an open wound. My chest felt tight, like there wasn't enough air in the room. There was more. A letter folded once. Eleanor. I don't know if you'll ever see this. I told myself I'd explain it someday. I told myself you'd hate me less if I waited until you were older. Then I told myself I'd take it to the grave. But the truth is, I've been a coward. I've loved two people in my life. Your mother. And her. Her name was Vanessa. I met her after your mother's stroke. It wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't looking for it. I know what you'll think, and I won't fight it. But she gave me light when I was drowning. I didn't plan Jonah, but when he came, I loved him. Not more than you, not less, Just different. He deserved better than being a secret. I know that. And you deserved better than being lied to. I should have told you. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But every time I looked at you, I saw your mother, your sacrifice, and I choked. He's your brother. Nothing changes that. I hope someday you'll understand why I kept him from you. It wasn't because I loved you less. It was because I didn't know how to hold both truths at once. I'm sorry, Dad. I read it once. Twice. I couldn't cry. The tears felt trapped, like they needed permission that would never come. Instead, I sat there staring at the words until the ink blurred. Jonah. 2007. Your brother. All those years I sat across from my father. All those dinners eaten in silence. All the times I thought I was the only thing tethering him to the world. And he'd been tethered to someone else too. Someone younger, someone lighter, someone chosen. I went into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. My reflection looked unfamiliar. A woman with grief stretching down her jawline, betrayal under her eyes, a life built on half-truths. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call Simon, but I knew he wouldn't pick up. He had already moved on years ago. He hadn't lived in the lie the way I had. He hadn't loved from inside it. Instead, I walked back to the living room, sat in the recliner, held the photo in both hands, and whispered to no one in particular. What else did I not know? I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I even blinked for hours. I just sat in that damn chair, the photo of the woman and the baby on the table beside me, the letter spread open like a wound that wouldn't close. Outside, the sky turned the kind of gray that makes everything look bleached. I watched the light shift across the walls, across the floorboards I used to scrub as a girl. The house felt foreign, like it had betrayed me in the same quiet way my father had. Not with action, with omission. Around 7:30, I heard the front gate creak. I stood slowly, already knowing who it was before the knock. 3 sharp raps, like he wasn't sure if he had the right to be there. When I opened the door, Jonah was standing on the porch again. Same hoodie, same solemn face. But this time there was something new in his expression, not fear, not expectation, just waiting. I stepped aside. He walked in without a word, brushing snowflakes off his sleeves. It had started to flurry some time before dawn, soft and slow. It clung to his hair. I noticed his fingers were trembling. I wasn't sure if you'd let me in, he said quietly. I didn't answer. He looked around the living room, his eyes drifting toward the recliner, toward the shelves, lined with faded photos and books no one had opened in years. He moved like he was afraid to touch anything, like the walls might snap at him. He used to tell me stories about this house, Jonah said, eyes tracing the mantel. Said you were the smart one. That you kept everything together. I still didn't speak. I wanted to see where he'd go with it. If he'd lie. If he'd pretend he hadn't been dropped into my life like a match on dry leaves. He wasn't perfect, Jonah said, glancing at me. I know that. I picked up the photo from the table and handed it to him. You were a baby here. He took it carefully, like it might crumble in his hands. A softness passed over his face. That's my mom, he said. Vanessa. She's still alive? He nodded. In Alberta. She didn't come to the funeral. Did she know about me? He paused. She knew. Some. He looked at me then. Really looked. She knew you existed, but he didn't talk about you much. Said it was complicated. I laughed, sharp and humorless. Complicated. That's one word for it. I sat down in the recliner. He stayed standing, holding the photo like a child holds a keepsake, unsure whether it belongs to them or not. He left you something Jonah said. I raised an eyebrow. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. The edges were worn, the spine cracked. I recognized it immediately, one of the old journals my father used to keep in the shed. I hadn't seen one in years. I used to think he scribbled lists in them. Grocery notes. Fix-it projects he never got to. He handed it to me, then sat on the edge of the sofa, elbows on his knees, waiting. I flipped through the first few pages. May 2012. Jonah has her eyes. God help me. He asked if he could call me Dad today. I told him not yet. What right do I have? I think about Eleanor every day. I'm splitting in two. The words blurred and I felt heat behind my eyes. But I kept reading. There's a quiet in me when I'm with him. A shame too. I look at his little fingers and think about how I never held hers enough. I don't deserve either of them. Each entry was short, fragmented, guilt bleeding through the lines, love too. It wasn't what I'd expected, not a justification, not some final plea for understanding, just a man trying to hold two lives in his hands and failing both. I closed the notebook and stared at the fireplace. For a while, neither of us said anything. I'm not here to take anything from you, Jonah said finally. That's good, I said, because there's not much left. He looked down. He wanted us to meet. Said he was waiting for the right time. I scoffed. The right time doesn't come after someone's in the ground. No, he said quietly. It doesn't. I studied him again, his hands, his posture, the way he looked at the room like it was full of relics. There was something in his face that reminded me of our father. The shape of his jaw, maybe. The tilt of his eyes when he was thinking. It made something twist inside me. Something I didn't want to name. He stood to leave. I'll go. I didn't stop him, not right away, but then just before he reached the door, I said, Wait. He turned. I held up the notebook. Would you mind if I read some of it out loud? He shook his head. Go ahead. I opened to a random page and began to read. My voice caught at first, but then it settled like it was sliding into a place that had always been waiting. June 3rd. I told him about Eleanor today. Told him she's the bravest person I know. He asked if she'd ever want to meet him. I said maybe. I hope she does. I hope she can forgive me for building a second life instead of fixing the first. I read until my voice wavered. Then I closed the book. Jonah didn't move. He just stood there watching me like I was something precious he didn't know how to hold. I don't forgive him, I said. He nodded. Me neither. But I don't hate him, I added. And I think maybe I don't hate you either. He gave a small smile. That's something. He left after that, quietly. No hug. No promise to stay in touch. Just a look, part apology, part invitation, and the sound of the door clicking softly behind him, the silence after he left, was different. Not emptier, just cleared out, like the air had been changed by someone opening a window. The house felt heavier after he left, like it had finally exhaled all the breath it had been holding for decades. I walked through each room slowly, ran my fingers along door frames, dusted shelves I hadn't touched in months. The kitchen still smelled like burnt coffee and lemon oil. The hallway mirror still had that small crack in the corner from the time my father dropped his shaving kit. And the upstairs linen closet still squeaked just slightly when I pulled it open. Everything had stayed, but I hadn't. I took 3 more days to decide what to do. The estate attorney called, offered to send the finalized documents for the property title transfer, wanted to know if I planned to sell the house, keep it, rent it. I told him I didn't know yet. He said I had time, but I already knew. I didn't want the house. Not because of Jonah. Not because I was angry, but because staying in that house any longer would be like living inside someone else's unfinished sentence. A sentence I'd spent my whole life trying to punctuate. I boxed up the photo albums. Not many. My father wasn't a sentimental man. A few dusty frames from the mantel, a ceramic bowl that had belonged to my mother's mother, and the journal Jonah had given me. I left the rest. The furniture, the books, the recliner. I imagined someone else sitting in it someday. I hoped it would be Jonah. Maybe then something would feel complete. He didn't come back. Not that week. Not the one after. But he sent a letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope with blocky, careful handwriting. Inside was a photo, one I'd never seen. My father and Jonah standing in front of a small lake. They looked like 2 strangers who had only just learned how to stand near each other. There was a note scribbled on the back. He talked about you every time. He just never knew how to say it right. I held that photo in my lap for a long time. That was the last thing I put in the box before I taped it shut. I found a realtor and listed the house a week later. I signed the documents in silence in that same too warm office where I'd heard my father's truth. Mr. Murray asked me gently if I was sure. I said I was. I was more than sure. I gave Jonah the deed. Legally, he was entitled to nothing. There was no clause in the will that said he would inherit property, only the stipend my father had arranged. But I couldn't live there. And something about handing it over to him without debate, without resentment, felt like placing a stone on a grave. A mark of presence. A kind of peace. He wrote back months later. Just 2 lines. I didn't expect it. I don't know what to say. But thank you. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. By spring, I had moved north. A small cottage near the Hudson, trees out back, a porch that catches the morning light. It isn't much. 1 bedroom, old pipes, an attic that smells like cedar and mothballs. But it's mine. Not inherited. Not shared. Not soaked in the silence of a man who couldn't choose between his children. I started planting things. Herbs first, thyme, rosemary, basil, then lavender, then tomatoes. I'm not very good at it, but I like the rhythm, the feeling of putting something in the ground that has no history, only future. There's a photo on my mantle now. Just one. It's me. At 30. Smiling, a law book in my lap. My hair pulled back in a way that always made me feel smart. I'd forgotten about that version of myself. She'd been buried under years of caretaking and grief. But when I look at her now, I see the woman I could have been, and maybe still can be in different ways. I don't talk about my father much. People assume things when you say you were the good daughter. They think you were loved for it, that you were seen. But there's a difference between being dependable and being cherished. A difference I've only now begun to understand. Some days I wonder what my life might have looked like if he'd told me the truth sooner. If I'd met Jonah as a child. if I'd been given the choice to love my brother without bitterness. But other days, most days, I just enjoy the quiet. Not the old silence. The new one. The clean one. The one that belongs to me. I cook for myself now. I eat by the window. I sleep without checking for footsteps in the hallway. I breathe without wondering what secrets are being kept behind the next closed door. And when the wind moves through the trees behind my cottage, I don't listen for anyone else's voice. Just my own. It was late April when I saw him again. I was planting lavender by the edge of the porch. The earth was finally soft enough to dig into that rich dark brown you can smell before you even touch it. I wore gloves, but the soil still found its way under my nails. It felt good. I'd always liked the quiet work of tending. I think I was always meant to create life, but I'd spent too many years keeping death at bay instead. I heard the car before I saw it. A modest sedan. Older model. The kind that sounds like it's asking permission before it parks. It pulled in slow tires crunching over the gravel. I stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and turned just as the engine cut off. Jonah stepped out. He looked older, taller. There was something in the way he moved, cautious but grounded, like he'd grown into his body since the last time we met. He wore a denim jacket frayed at the cuffs, and his hair was a little longer than before. There was a paper bag in his hand. I brought pie, he said, lifting it like an offering. I nodded. I didn't know you were coming. I didn't know I was either. I was just driving. He stepped closer, eyes scanning the cottage, the garden beds, the wind chimes hanging from the porch roof. It's nice here, he said. It's quiet. I like that. We stood there in the stillness for a beat longer than comfort allowed. Then I nodded toward the porch. You hungry? He nodded. Starving. Inside, I made coffee. He unboxed the pie cherry homemade, slightly lopsided like it had been through a few turns in the car. We sat at the small kitchen table, 2 slices between us, steam rising from our mugs. For a while, we didn't talk. We just ate. Then quietly, he said, I think I hated him after he died. I looked up. He wasn't crying. But his voice had that rawness, the kind you hear when someone is finally saying a thing they've swallowed for too long. He made me feel like I was a secret, like I was shameful, like I had to be this quiet pocket in his life that never touched anything else. And I didn't realize how deep it went until he was gone. I said nothing, just sipped my coffee. I know he cared about you, Jonah said, more than I think he even understood. I know, and I think he thought loving both of us was impossible. I nodded, because it was. He looked at me, startled by the bluntness. He couldn't live honestly, I said. He didn't know how. And maybe it's not fair to expect people from his generation to have that kind of emotional fluency. But it doesn't make it less cruel. Jonah stared down at his plate. I used to think sacrifice was the highest form of love, I said. Now I think it's just what women are taught to do so men can live more freely. It came out sharper than I intended. I wasn't angry at Jonah. Not anymore. But I still carried the burn of all the years I'd lived in shadows. The years I'd been dependable, quiet, invisible. I didn't come to make anything harder, he said. You didn't. We sat in silence again, the air between us thick with a grief we both carried differently. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a necklace, a thin chain with a small locket. This was hers, he said. My mom's. She passed away last month. I blinked. I didn't know. He nodded. Breast cancer. She didn't want treatment. said she was tired. He placed the necklace on the table between us. She wanted you to have it. I stared at the locket. It was delicate, worn smooth at the edges. I didn't reach for it. She used to ask about you, Jonah said. I think she felt guilty, but she also admired you. Said anyone who stayed that long in that house must have had a heart like iron. I didn't stay out of strength, I said. I stayed because I thought leaving would make me unlovable. He looked at me. You're not. The words sat between us. I felt them more than heard them. We ate in silence again. The pie was good, tart and sweet just like I remembered from when my mother used to make it on Sundays. It was strange feeling something so familiar from someone so foreign. As he stood to leave, he looked around once more. Do you think you'll stay here forever? He asked. I don't know. I don't make promises like that anymore. He nodded. Smart. At the door, he paused. I don't have a sister, he said. Not in the traditional sense. We didn't grow up together. We don't know each other's stories. I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. But I'd like to. I didn't respond. Not directly. I just reached behind me, grabbed the second slice of pie from the counter and handed it to him in a paper towel. For the road, I said. He smiled. Thanks. Then he walked out to his car and drove away. I watched the dust rise behind his wheels and disappear into the air. I didn't cry. I didn't fall apart. I just stood there, the wind in my hair, the necklace still resting on the kitchen table behind me. He wasn't my brother. Not yet. But maybe. Someday, there are things you don't realize were stolen until much later. Not money, not jewelry, not things you can lock in a box or list in a will. Time, choices, versions of yourself that never had the chance to exist. I sat on the porch that evening with a blanket across my lap and a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The birds were loud that night, calling to each other across the trees like old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. A woodpecker tapped somewhere in the distance, and every few minutes the wind would shift just enough to carry the scent of lavender from the garden to where I sat. I should have felt at peace. I had the deed to this cottage in my name. My own space, no one to answer to, no one else's meals to cook, no moods to navigate. But something still hummed inside me, a kind of residue, the kind that sticks even after you've scrubbed the walls clean. I thought about my father. I thought about how he used to fold his newspaper so neatly before setting it down like he couldn't leave anything unfinished. Except he left me unfinished, and I suppose I let him. Growing up, I used to wait for his approval like sunlight. I'd come home with good grades, a ribbon from the school spelling bee, a pressed blouse I'd ironed myself, and if I was lucky, he'd give me one of those slow nods, the kind that wasn't exactly pride, but wasn't nothing either, and I fed off it, like a starving thing. When Mom got sick, I thought maybe that would be the thing that changed us. That he'd see me finally not just as a daughter, but as a woman, a caretaker, an equal in grief. But I see now that I was never anything more to him than a solution. A piece of furniture that moved when needed, then faded into the background. And when Vanessa came into his life, when Jonah came, he didn't just make a second family. He gave away what I'd spent years earning. He gave it, freely, easily. Love, attention, vulnerability, the very things he made me work for, until my bones ached from trying. I didn't resent Jonah for that. Not anymore, but I resented the girl I used to be. The one who kept showing up at his emotional doorstep like a dog waiting to be let in. I thought about all the things I'd given up, The trip to Montreal I canceled when my father twisted his ankle. The man who proposed to me when I was 32, a kind, quiet accountant named David, who liked to cook and wanted 3 children. I'd said no because my father said it was too soon after your mother and I believed him, believed that mourning came before happiness, that daughters waited until fathers gave permission to live. I remembered a night maybe 15 years ago when I got dressed up to go to a holiday party at work. I wore a burgundy dress that hugged my figure. Put on the red lipstick, I loved the same one my mother used to wear. And when I walked into the living room to grab my keys, my father looked up from his chair, squinted, and said, "You're not leaving the house looking like that, are you?" I wiped it off in the hallway mirror, drove to the party, stayed for 20 minutes, came home early and cried into my pillow, ashamed of myself for daring to want joy. You don't forget those moments. You carry them, quietly, like shards of glass in your pockets. But sitting there on my porch, tea cold in my hands, I realized something else. I gave more than he ever asked for. And maybe that's my fault. Maybe I confused loyalty with identity. Maybe I thought that if I just kept giving, he'd finally have enough room inside him to love me back the way I needed. But now I'm learning to give to myself. The first time I bought flowers just for me, not for a guest, not for a hospital bedside, I cried in the parking lot of the grocery store. It was ridiculous. A $5 bundle of tulips, but they were yellow and full and alive. I brought them home, cut the stems, and placed them in a blue glass vase by the window. They lasted a week. Every time I passed them, I smiled. Not because of the flowers, but because I'd chosen them. For me. That's what recovery looks like, I think. Not some dramatic transformation. Not a burning of the past. But a slow reintroduction to yourself. 100 tiny acts of self-recognition. A cup of coffee in the sun. A refusal to answer the phone just because it rings. A photo of a younger you finally placed in a frame and given a place of honor. I used to think survival meant hardening, becoming untouchable. Now I think it means softening where you were once bruised, making space for gentleness, for questions without answers. The man who raised me died with his secrets intact. But I'm not him, and I don't want to be. I want to live in the open, even if it means letting people see the cracks. Even if it means standing on a porch alone, tea gone cold, heart still healing, and saying out loud, "He didn't give me what I needed, but I'm learning to give it to myself." I never changed my last name. Not when I was younger, not when I was engaged. Not when I finally moved out of that house and left my father's memory behind like a coat hung on the back of a door I'd never open again. Thompson. It always felt like a stamp, more than a name. A label burned into my skin that said, "You belong to someone else. You stay. You endure." For a while I told myself I kept it because it was easier. No paperwork, no questions. But the truth is, I kept it because I wanted it to mean something. I wanted the world to know I was his daughter, the good one. The one who stayed, the one who made herself small so he wouldn't have to feel the weight of what he'd done. But names don't mean loyalty. They don't mean love. They mean history. And mine was full of empty rooms and locked drawers. Still, I never changed it. I sat with that one morning months after Jonah's visit. I was sorting through a folder of old documents, insurance forms, utility bills, things I'd brought with me in a box when I left the house. At the bottom was my birth certificate, folded once, faded at the edges. I hadn't looked at it in years. There it was. Eleanor Marie Thompson, Father Richard Allen Thompson, Mother Margaret Louise Thompson, née Carter. It didn't surprise me that he had insisted on naming me after his own mother. That was the way he operated, tie things back to the past. Keep the roots deep and close, even if it meant choking new growth. I traced the letters with my fingertip, as if the ink could still remember being pressed into the page, and I thought for the first time what it might mean to let it go, not as revenge, not as rejection, but as release. I didn't rush it. I didn't tear it up or file paperwork the next day. I just started saying my name differently in my head. Eleanor. Just Eleanor. No family tree trailing behind it. No weight of what I was supposed to be. Just a woman with a garden, a stack of books she's finally making time to read, and a slow, steady breath in her lungs. It felt unfamiliar. Like trying on a dress you're not sure you have the confidence to wear yet. But it also felt right. That weekend I called the DMV. Just asked what the process would be if I wanted to drop a last name. The woman on the phone was kind. Said it happens more often than I'd think. Said sometimes people just need to start over. Start over. Not run away. Not erase. Start. The word hung in the air long after I'd hung up the phone. I took long walks that week, down to the edge of the forest trail near my property through the tall pines where the sunlight came in filtered and gold. I watched the way the wind moved through the trees, bending them just enough, never breaking them, and I thought about all the bending I had done in my life. All the times I'd curved myself around someone else's silence. And I thought, no more. That Saturday, I wrote my name in a notebook the way I wanted it to look. Eleanor Marie. Just that. Nothing else. Not because I didn't have a family, but because I was no longer willing to be defined by the shape of their absences. I didn't tell Jonah. Not yet. But I imagined what he might say. He'd probably understand. He was raised in the shadow of someone else's shame. We were opposite sides of the same coin. He bore the cost of being hidden. I bore the cost of being visible but unseen. That's the thing about secrets. They don't just protect people. They punish them. He and I... We were both punishment in different ways. Still, I kept his letter, the one he sent after I gave him the house. I read it sometimes on nights when the wind is strong and the air feels thick with memory. I didn't expect it. I don't know what to say, but thank you. 10 words. And yet more than I ever got from my father in 20 years. There's a quiet between us now. Not avoidance, not distance, just a space we're both learning how to step into gently. I send him birthday cards. He texts me, sometimes pictures of the house, now repainted pale blue, the garden beginning to bloom again. He planted apple trees out back. Says he wants to learn how to make cider. I told him I'd visit once the first fruit comes in. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. I'm not making promises I can't keep anymore. To him. To anyone. I look at my hands sometimes the way the veins run like roots under the surface. My mother's hands. The same delicate fingers. The same soft nails she used to file into little ovals. I remember how she held a teacup always with 2 hands, always with a little sigh before the first sip. I wonder if she knew about Jonah, about Vanessa, about what my father did with the space she left behind. Part of me thinks she did. She always saw more than she let on, but she was raised in a time when women swallowed their questions, wrapped them in linens and buried them under folded bedsheets. Maybe she thought she was protecting me. Maybe she was just too tired to fight anymore. I can't blame her. Not now. Not after everything. But I won't follow her path. I will ask the questions. I will hold the answers even if they burn. I will say my name, the one I choose, not the one. I was handed with clarity. Because after all the lies and silences, the twisted loyalties and second lives, the only thing that's ever truly been mine is my voice, and I'm finally using it. It started with a knock. Not a dramatic one, not urgent. Just 3 soft taps like someone wasn't sure they were welcome. I was in the kitchen steeping tea, listening to a storm roll in across the hills. The sky had turned the color of bruised slate, and the wind was teasing the corners of the cottage with long, sighing breaths. I hadn't had a visitor in weeks. I opened the door and found Mrs. Hartley standing there, my neighbor from 2 cottages down. Widowed kind, the sort of woman who brings over extra bread when she bakes not out of charity but out of habit. She held a glass container wrapped in a blue dish towel. "Thought you might want some warm cornbread for the storm," she said, her smile gentle. I smiled back. "You always know." She stepped in without waiting for an invitation. She always did that. Said porches were for strangers and friends were meant for kitchens. We sat with our tea and her cornbread, the rain beginning to tap the windows in a rhythm that sounded like memory. She asked me how the garden was coming. I asked her about her granddaughter's new job. We talked about everything except the thing I needed to say, the thing I'd been building toward for weeks. Then she said out of nowhere, "Do you ever miss him?" I looked up. "My father." She nodded. It caught me off guard how plainly she asked it. No apology, no flinching. "I don't know if Mrs. is the word," I said slowly. She waited. I took a sip of tea. The steam curled around my face. It smelled of bergamot and something older like rain on stones. "I miss what I thought he was," I said. "What I tried to believe he could become." She nodded like she understood more than she let on. "I stayed with him long after I should have left," I said. "I gave him all the soft parts of myself. And when I realized he'd given them to someone else without ever telling me, I trailed off." The words felt sharp, like they had edges, and I'd just cut my tongue on them. "I didn't hate him," I continued, "but I stopped waiting for him to choose me." There. It was out. A truth I'd never spoken aloud before. Not to Simon. Not to Jonah. Not even to myself, really. Not in language that clear. Mrs. Hartley didn't speak for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand lightly over mine. Her skin was warm, worn with age. "That's the loneliest part, isn't it?" she said, realizing they never saw us fully. I nodded, and that we let them look away. I'd never been able to say it before, that I'd known deep down for years, that every silence, every deflection, every Thursday night phone call I pretended not to hear was part of a larger pattern I refused to name. I think I believed that if I kept the peace eventually, he would turn to me and say, "Thank you. I see you. You were right to stay." But he never did. He died before I could even ask why he waited so long to be honest. And in that gap, that breath between the last lie and the end of his life, he handed me a second brother, a second betrayal, a second chance, all in one. Mrs. Hartley stayed for another hour. We didn't talk much after that. We just sat and listened to the rain. She left just before dark, the container empty, the blue towel folded neatly and handed back to her like a ritual. That night I sat at my desk and wrote Jonah a letter. Not typed. Handwritten. I wanted him to feel the pauses, the weight of my pen, the smudges where I changed my mind. Jonah, I don't know what you think of me, and I'm not sure it matters yet, but I need you to know something. I loved our father in a way that made me forget to love myself. I don't blame you for what he did or didn't do, but I do resent the silence, the years, the choice he made to love you in private while loving me in performance. That wasn't your fault, but it became my burden. I'm putting it down now. Not for him, for me. I hope the house gives you more peace than it gave me. I hope you plant things. I hope you tear up the carpet in the den and find the hardwood underneath. I hope you play music in that kitchen, something soft, something defiant. And if you ever wonder who I am, who I was before all this, know that I'm finally finding out too. Eleanor, I didn't mail it. Not yet. It sits in a drawer beside my bed next to the locket from his mother and the photo I keep of myself at 30. Some letters aren't meant for postage. Some are meant for release. The next morning, I opened the window and let the air move through the cottage. It smelled of wet earth and something electric, like a beginning. I brewed my tea, sat on the porch, watched the way the fog curled around the trees, soft and unhurried. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone else's daughter. I felt like myself. And I wasn't sorry. The call came in mid-June. Jonah's voice on the other end, hesitant, but clearer than before. I'm thinking of selling the house. I was sitting in my garden barefoot, a book open in my lap that I hadn't turned the page of in 20 minutes. I looked up toward the trees as he spoke the words, threading into the sky like smoke. I wanted to ask if you'd be all right with that, he added quickly. I know you gave it to me, but I didn't want to do anything without... He trailed off. I could hear birdsong in the background on his end, maybe from the old tree outside the den window, the one that used to scrape the glass whenever the wind picked up. I don't need to keep it, I said softly. It wasn't a home to me in the end, just a container for everything that wasn't said. There was a pause, thick with something unspeakable. I thought I'd feel closer to him being there, Jonah said. But it's like walking through someone else's past with a key that doesn't fit any of the doors. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. That sounds about right. He left so much half-built, he said. So many drawers full of screws and receipts and versions of himself. I smiled, a small, sad thing. That's who he was. A man who carried pieces of his life in pockets, hoping no one would ever turn them out. I keep wondering if he ever felt it. Complete, Jonah murmured. With her. With you. With me. He didn't, I said. But I don't think he expected to. He just survived. And somewhere along the way, he mistook that for living. It wasn't bitterness, just a truth I'd waited years to speak aloud. I'll put the house on the market, Jonah said. Split the money with you? No, I said gently but firmly. Keep it. Build something. Something yours. He didn't argue. We hung up after that. No plans. No visit, just a quiet understanding passing back and forth through the phone like an heirloom we didn't know we shared. That evening I found the old photo again, the one of Jonah as a baby in his mother's arms. I looked at it differently this time, not through the lens of betrayal, but through the shape of survival, of a woman who must have loved her son so fiercely she let him live in secrecy if it meant he could still have some part of his father. I wondered what Vanessa had given up, what she'd known, what she'd been promised, and how little of it was actually delivered. I didn't envy her. but I pitied the version of me that had once hated her without ever knowing her name. I sat down and wrote a letter to her too. Vanessa, I never got to know you. I don't know what you were told, what you believed, what you questioned, but I imagine you've known loneliness too. I imagine you, like me, waited for truths that never came. I resented you. For years. Silently. I thought you took something from me. A father, a space, a voice. But the truth is we were both playing second to a man who never knew how to give either of us the whole version of himself. I hope he gave you something real, even if it was small. I hope Jonah brought light into your life. He carries more grace in him than most people I know. That has to come from somewhere. I'm not asking for anything, just peace between women, between shadows. Eleanor, I didn't have an address. I had no intention of sending it, but writing it felt like turning a page I hadn't realized was still open. I burned it in the fireplace the next morning. The paper curled slowly, blackened, became smoke. Not anger, not vengeance, just release. The next week, Jonah sent a photo, a real one printed on glossy paper and tucked into an envelope. It was the backyard. Grass freshly cut. A for sale sign tilted slightly to one side, like it wasn't quite sure if it belonged there. On the back he wrote, "Sometimes letting go is the bravest part. Thank you for teaching me how." I cried when I read it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears slipping down my face like something old and tired leaving my body. I took that photo and pinned it to the wall beside my mirror, not as a memory of the house, but as proof that we were learning how to leave each other kindly, that we were learning finally to be honest with ourselves and each other. That summer I planted peonies, pale pink, full-blooming, fragile and stubborn all at once. My mother had loved them. My father had hated the mess when their petals fell. They bloomed twice before the season turned, and for the first time, I didn't rush to clean them up when the petals hit the ground. I just let them fall. Let them soften into the earth. Let them feed what came next. There was one room in the old house I never stepped into after he died. My mother's room. After we moved her hospital bed into the den for the last 6 months of her life, the bedroom stayed shut. The door had a heavy sound when it closed, that old latch that didn't quite catch, so you had to pull it twice. My father never went in there either. Or if he did, he made sure I never saw him. Sometimes I'd catch a trace of her perfume in the hallway, faint, like something that didn't want to be remembered but refused to disappear. I don't know why I avoided it. Maybe because it had once held everything soft in that house. My mother's sewing machine in the corner, her pale blue robe always folded over the chair. A worn copy of Wuthering Heights on the nightstand with a bookmark forever stuck halfway through. She read it every year but never finished. Said the ending didn't matter when you already knew the ache. I thought about that room often after I left the house for good. More often than I thought I would. I imagined the way it must have smelled: lavender sachets, mothballs, old cedar. I pictured the indentation on her side of the bed, the one that never bounced back even years later, and I thought about the closet, whether he had ever gone through her things after she passed, whether he left them all untouched like a shrine, or whether he'd packed them away, shoved them into boxes as if that would stop her from haunting the corners of his life. I think I knew even then that he hadn't let her go. Not really. And maybe that's why he found Vanessa. Not because he stopped loving my mother, but because he couldn't bear the grief. And I was part of that grief. I reminded him of what he'd lost every time I walked into a room and straightened a picture frame or filled a glass the way she used to. We were both ghosts to him in our own way. He just found a living woman to chase instead. I don't excuse him, but I've stopped asking him to be more than he was. That's a kind of freedom I didn't think I'd ever taste. To stop trying to rewrite someone else's character in the middle of your own story. But that room, even now in this new home, I think about it. I wonder if Jonah ever went inside. If he opened the closet, touched the scarves she used to wear. If he found the stack of letters she wrote to herself tucked between the pages of her books. Reminders that she was still here, still breathing, still herself. I wrote letters like that too, but I never left them behind. I burned them, or buried them, or let them dissolve at the bottom of the laundry basket, ink bleeding into the fabric of my grief. I made a promise to myself after I moved no more closed rooms. Everything stays open here, even the hard things, even the past. There's a small room at the back of this cottage, just big enough for a chair and a lamp and a bookshelf. It used to be a pantry, I think. I turned it into a reading room. The walls are a soft cream. The light is warm, always golden in the evenings. I keep a stack of books in the corner, including Wuthering Heights still unread past the halfway mark. Sometimes I sit in there, book closed on my lap, and just listen. To the wind through the trees, to the creak of the floor settling, to the sound of my own breath, full and slow and present. That room is mine, not inherited, not preserved, not filled with someone else's silence. Mine. I brought nothing from the old bedroom, not the robe, not the books, not the sadness, but I carry her with me, not as a ghost, but as a seed. She is in the way I steep my tea, in the way I tilt my head when I'm thinking, in the way I sit with loss without flinching. I didn't need to open the door to say goodbye. Some closures happen from the inside, and I think maybe letting that room stay untouched was its own kind of boundary. A way of saying, your grief ends here. Mine begins beyond it. So I didn't enter it, but I forgave it. The house sold last week. Jonah called again, not to ask permission, but just to say it was done. He sounded lighter. He said the new owners were a young couple, expecting their first child. They wanted to knock out the den wall and open up the kitchen. I said I hoped they did. I said I hoped they painted everything bright yellow and filled the rooms with music. He laughed. "You're not sentimental, are you?" I paused. "No," I said. Not for things that kept me small. And it was true. That house may have built me, but it also buried me. And every day I live beyond it, I reclaim another inch of skin, another breath, another choice. The room I never entered. It no longer has power over me. None of it does. I am not the secrets. I am not the silence. I am not the daughter who stayed just to be seen. I am the woman who left. And in leaving, I finally came home. Some treasures had been recovered. Others more valuable still had been discovered for the first time. Not everything was resolved. Some days I still feel the old ache, the space where my father's voice used to echo in the silence, where my mother's scent used to linger in the sheets. Some memories are stubborn like that. They refuse to leave quietly, but I've stopped trying to evict them. Now I just let them sit beside me. Brief visitors, not rulers. I don't think I'll ever be someone who forgets easily, but I've become someone who remembers differently. Not through the lens of longing or blame, but through clarity. That's what this new life has given me. Not a perfect piece, but an honest one. There are photos of me now. Smiling alone, not posed. Real. I take long walks without telling anyone where I'm going. I plant things that bloom on their own time. I keep the windows open even when the wind is cold. Some days I still hear his voice, my father's. A line he used to say when he didn't know how to answer a question. Some things are better left unsaid. Maybe he was right, but I think some things are better said late than never at all. So here it is, I loved him. He failed me, and still I survived. I forgave him. Not for him, for me. And I learned that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about coming back to yourself after the parts of you were handed out, hidden, or withheld. It wasn't the ending I'd expected. It was better, harder, clearer, more honest. It was mine. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.